Rebekah Roth here again. And I have been asked a question via email to my publisher that is such an interesting question, I honestly could ponder it for hours, but I won't. Let me just share with you the question. It's a fascinating question, and you can probably think about this. If the question was, what would have happened if the crew members had all followed the FAA hijack protocol? Well, our lives would be totally different now. I suppose we'd still be wearing our belts and our shoes as we boarded an airplane. It's interesting because let me just say this is how it would have happened. And that's why when I talked about this in a previous video, it's inside my knowledge of the airline. Flight 11's story is complete nonsense that they could do climb out and these passengers would get out. Of course, they didn't get on, the Arabs, but somebody was doing something. We don't know what. But for anybody to get out of their seat and do anything while the flight attendants are barely able to get out of their jump seat, let alone get and kill people and all that crazy nonsense. Well, here, let me tell you what would have happened. When I don't know, let's just say 9A and B, that's who the flight attendants said they were on Flight 11. That's who they said they were, the hijackers. I found that in multiple documents, by the way, in the Freedom of Information Act. This is not just a fluke thing. And I know one thing, the flight attendants would never make a mistake by claiming that you are the hijacker if you're not, because this is what would have happened. The lead flight attendant would have picked up the interphone, told the pilot 2 code words. I'm not going to use them, but they would have used them in a conversation such as, Captain, let's just say Johnson, this is Mrs. Rebekah Roth, very formally, and throw in those code words into a couple sentences, which would immediately notify him there is a hijacker in this cabin that I will do everything I can do to prevent him from coming into the cockpit. So will the rest of the crew. The rest of the crew, if they weren't involved with this person directly, of course we know now, would have been told to go find a seat. And there were 100 empty seats on Flight 11, roughly. Wouldn't have been hard to find an empty seat and disappear, put a coat or a blanket over your uniform, pretend to be asleep, and leave that one person that's now on the phone to the pilot. But what we were told, and this is fascinating because I'm inside the airline, what we were told is that Betty Ong told us that the pilots weren't answering their phone. Well, what would I do if I would have been Betty Ong? I would have marched right up there and used the cockpit key and gone inside. Or I would have asked the flight attendants up front, what's wrong with the pilots? They're not answering their phone. We never did find out why she was calling the pilots that early on in the flight. Were they landing? I'm assuming they were, and that was why she would have done that. But she had no reason to call the pilots. She didn't know they were being hijacked. She said that. She was very confused, which tells me she didn't know who the hijackers were, if there were any. She wasn't even sure there was a hijacking going on. But back to the protocol. There would have been one person, in this case it would have been Karen Martin, she's the purser on that flight, and she would have been handling. Now, interesting, Karen Martin was extremely athletic. She was quite tall, and she golfed from the men's tees. That's how athletic she was. She loved to golf, she was very athletic. So if you put the government story in there with these 5'6", 140-pounders against Karen Martin, extremely athletic, taller than them, they probably would not have succeeded to get into the cockpit. However, they didn't even get on the plane. So when you look at this, knowing everything that it's taken nearly a decade to uncover all this with literally hundreds of people bringing information to me. A hijack protocol was set up that a phone call with the code words would tell the pilot, we have a hijacker on board and I will not let him in the cockpit. That is that girl's only job. That's what she said to him in that code words. By being very formal, talking these code words, he knew. And then what would he do? He would squawk the hijack code 7500 on the radio, which would have broadcast to anybody that's around, other air traffic controllers, everybody known, this airplane is hijacked. So that tells them that it might do something like turn around or go up and down or, go off course, fly erratically. That also would start the process of getting the plane on the ground, because that's what we would have done. Now, every bit of that protocol was set up that when you use the formal conversation and the code words, nothing else needed to be said between you and the pilot. They knew you were doing your job, which none of the crew members did on 9/11, which I always found very weird, but they also didn't have a successful ending. A successful ending, it would have been landing the plane wherever the nearest airport was that they could set things up. And on the ground, the company, dispatch, operations people, security people would all be on the phone. They would be with each other. They would be finding an airport. And at that airport, they would be finding the nearest military-based people or SWAT team people from the nearest police stations and getting all that set up on the ground. So once that airplane lands, then they will approach the aircraft. Now, at the end of that story, if there were hijackers on the plane, they would either be taken out, subdued, maybe hit over the head by somebody, who knows, maybe shot when the SWAT team gets there, or the Green Beret or whatever was available. It was a matter of basically wherever we landed, what the police force was like, or if there was a military base by, they would just grab all these people. And all that stuff would be being done by the company, the FAA, the military, and all that stuff. So once we got on the ground, keeping in mind, normally it takes roughly 20 to 30 minutes from cruise altitude to get into an airport. So there would have been all kinds of stuff. Let's say you went into Cleveland and not other airplanes were landing like on 9/11, but just you went in and unannounced. You were, obviously, the air traffic controllers were known you were coming, but they were also known you were a hijack, and they had a code word. So the hijacker, the air traffic controller and the pilots had a code word that they used as well, one of the code words. So they would use that and they would know. And I'll tell you what that one is, probably is the same one. But they would say, this is not, and you may have seen this, may have read this about a Delta 1989, this is not a trip, is the code word. Telling the pilots, telling the air traffic controllers, it is or is not a hijack. They called it a trip flight. So once you got on the ground then, the people on the ground, military, whoever's going to board the aircraft or negotiate with the hijackers or what have you, then they would communicate through the pilots, through the cockpit, through the radio. And then they would communicate through the interphone with us. So that's kind of how that would have gone. Why it didn't go that way? Well, it's anybody's guess at this point, since we know it wasn't a real hijacking. If it would have been a hijacking, Betty Ong wouldn't have been confused. She would have definitely said, there's been a hijacking on this plane, blah, blah, blah. She wouldn't have said other weird things like I'm at my jump seat at 3 right, because again, if you missed that video, you would not sit in your jump seat in a hijacking, period, end of story. And so when I got into looking into this, I thought, what? Is this some kind of code? Does she think maybe someday a flight attendant will look into this and see that they weren't being hijacked, because she's sitting in her jump seat and she said it multiple times? I still don't know the answer to that. So. But a successful hijacking, everyone, maybe not the hijackers, but everyone, the crew members and the passengers would all live through it to fly another day. Now, let's take that one step further just for a few moments. Let's just ponder and think about how much it changed our lives when what they told us didn't really even happen. Do you remember what happened as soon as this, I'll tell you, because I was there, I don't know, it took about a week before I was flying all over after 9/11. First thing they did was they hired a bunch of college students to go through your luggage. They were not trained at all. They were supposed to make you feel secure, but probably most of you figured it out. They were just pimple-faced college kids rifling through your stuff. They rifled through our stuff too, squeezed out our toothpaste sometimes. This is really stupid things. But think about how much our world has changed because of 9/11. Now think about this. How would you feel if you could get it through your head? Let me just say this. It took me a while. It took a while for me. I literally had to write this down and just put it on a Post-it note. I just could not. I had been so brainwashed. And I never believed that our government was lying to us. I was never a conspiracy person. I always believed they would be there for us and for our passengers. I wouldn't get on an airplane now to save your soul or mine. I would absolutely not consider going anywhere for multiple reasons, however. But think about how different our lives would have been. Oh, you know what? They'd have been just like they were on September 10th, 2001. Remember when Donald Rumsfeld was on television telling us that Rabbi Dov Zakheim, the banker at the Pentagon, had lost $2.3 trillion. Just misplaced it somewhere. I don't know where it went. $2.3 trillion. Just, I don't know. Maybe it fell into an ashtray and it burned up. Who knows? I can't find it. I can't find it anywhere. Now, isn't it interesting? Let's go one step and then that's the end of this. The missile that hit the Pentagon, because we know Flight 77 was actually on the ground at Westover. How do we know that? Because we have eyewitnesses to it, and they were on the phone. They were making phone calls. Cell phones didn't work on a plane of above about 1,800 feet, ever, in 2001. That's what we know. And so we know they were lying. They were lying about the hijackers, lying about the phone calls, lying about the planes hitting the buildings, lying about all of this stuff. But let's wonder, what would it be like to have that kind of freedom? And now let's ponder one thing. What happened right after 9/11? Well, the Patriot Act came out. The Patriot Act was written well in advance. Somebody knew this was going to happen. That somebody knew because they had a whole bunch of put options, selling stock and shorting stock and buying stock and getting rid of stock and doing all kinds of stuff in the stock market. I have some of that data too. I know who you are. Yeah, there was foreknowledge all over. But let's think for a moment about how it was, because it should be that way right now. And the fact that it isn't that way right now, that it isn't like it was September 10th, with that missing money out there, and we could just walk through the metal tester and you could keep your belt on, your bra on, your glasses on, your computer in your bag. Remember those days? If you're old enough to remember those days of freedom, we lost it. We lost it over something that really wasn't even happening. And I'm going to do another video and we're going to look into this because somebody benefited from this. They had foreknowledge. They knew it was going to happen. They knew who they were going to blame it on. And they knew what was coming next. Somebody benefited. And we know it wasn't the traveling public in the United States of America or anywhere else. We lost our freedom that day over something that didn't really happen the way they told us. So more to come.